Hey folks, welcome to Trace3's vlog. My name is Kyle Gililland. I'm the Vice President of Security Services here at Trace3. Today we're going to be talking about data security, specifically data loss prevention or DLP, with one of our favorite partners, Proofpoint. We're joined by Brian Reed, Senior Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint. Brian, welcome to the party.
Thanks, Kyle. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, so as I said, we're going to be talking about DLP, which, obviously it's been around for a long time. I've been in the industry for many, many years, sometimes more than I'd like to admit. And DLP has been part of the conversation for, a long, long time. But, for some reason, we're seeing an uptick recently. I don't know if that's just me and what I'm seeing, or if maybe you over at Proofpoint are seeing the same thing.
No, you're totally right, Kyle. We're seeing exactly the same thing. There's been a bit of a renewed interest or a renaissance around DLP. And I think the big reason for that is we're not just running around chasing content anymore. We're really trying to understand user intent and understanding people and how they're choosing to interact with all of these modern applications and modern data types that we're using. For those of us who have been around really long, like you and I, DLP really started out as the content monitoring and filtering market, but the focus really needed to evolve beyond just content awareness. So it was super important to get that context in there. So things like I said, unpacking user intent and user behavior, as well as an understanding of the modern threat landscape, are really the key components to a modern DLP program.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think the way that I see it, the way that we see it at Trace3 is that, not only has there been an increase in kind of the amount of data, the types of data that we're trying to protect, but also, as you pointed out, the threat landscape has changed, right? I mean, we've shifted to work from home. And so not only do we have to protect kind of the data, but we've got to protect the data wherever it lives, right? Which could be, at your user's house, it could be at the Starbucks, right? It could be with the SaaS provider, right? So the landscape has certainly changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you summed it up well. I mean, the way I talk about it very simply is, people are working from anywhere and your data could theoretically be everywhere all at once. I would say the concerns even, beyond sort of that people are anywhere and data is everywhere. We've also got, newer philosophies that might not be so new debatably, things like zero trust that were really addressed at aiming at a lot of these sorts of problems, least privilege and the like. But today, the problem is really centered around two things. The stakes are incredibly high when it comes to our data. I mean, look at all the rise in ransomware incidents and people dealing with that problem, and the costs and risks to your data is huge. And also the tooling for these things has gotten so much better, both on the defender side as well as on the adversary side.
Yeah, definitely a good call out. I mean, we help folks at Trace3 on both the pre-breach and the post-breach side. Certainly, counseling our clients to implement technologies like DLP on the front end to really help identify where the data is, protect where the data goes and who might have access to it. But on the back end of that, right, we're commonly seeing those organizations that maybe haven't deployed this really wishing they had, right? The idea that DLP has been around for so long, people kind of kicking themselves because they haven't deployed it. I think the challenge that a lot of folks run into is that, well, maybe they tried it 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and it was just so hard to deploy. And what we've found is that, to your point, the tools have gotten better, specifically Proofpoint, making it far easier for organizations to deploy and making it far more approachable for not only the technical users, but the end users as well.
Yeah, a lot of security leaders, and for that matter, a lot of business leaders and organizations are really kind of caught up in the horror stories of the past, right? These DLP deployments that have gone wrong are certainly alive and well in a lot of people's history. A lot of us have the scars of that, issue of just chasing content instead of, like I said, understanding behaviors and understanding what that means in the context of the threat landscape. But I used to talk about DLP when I was an industry analyst in my past life as a really bad three-letter word. If you break down what DLP stands for, data loss prevention, and you think about most DLP programs didn't factor in all data types into the scope. Not all loss scenarios could be well-defined or even managed or mitigated. And if you think about a data security program, you don't necessarily just want to jump to prevention. Prevention's not always your ideal state. think about insider risk and insider threat and employee monitoring. You might not want to tip somebody off that's an insider that you're actively blocking them. You might want to be in more of a monitoring mode in that case. So I think DLP was a bit of a misnomer. Talking about Proofpoint for a minute. Yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, like the use cases have shifted, right? I mean, you're talking about, insider risk, you're talking about, various external threat actors, but there's also the big elephant in the room, right? I mean, our technology stacks have changed, right? No longer are we necessarily all on premise. We're shifting to the cloud. We're leveraging SaaS providers. How do you see a lot of organizations leveraging Proofpoint with some of those more, now at least, more common use cases like cloud data repositories?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have traditionally seen Proofpoint as a really good email security provider, and we absolutely are great at that. But we've really spent the last several years evolving the platform and a modern approach to enterprise DLP. Again, like I mentioned, not just about chasing content, it's about understanding people, unpacking user intent, what that user experience should look like when you have that cross-channel visibility across email, like you mentioned, cloud and web, endpoint. And it's really about creating a consistent policy across all those channels, and also to create some efficiency in your DLP program. And Kyle, like you mentioned, the shift to cloud and SaaS solutions has really changed the game, but it's also raised the importance of DLP. We all need to make sure that the organization's data, when it gets uploaded to your authorized cloud environments and your SaaS applications, is going to the right place, it's held in the right ways. That's impossible to do without having the right technical controls in place. And Proofpoint really helps tackle that with that unified cross-channel policy and visibility, all the way from the endpoint through the cloud application, through different SaaS applications, to ensure that there's that policy consistency and uniformity.
That's great. And frankly, one of the things that we love about the Proofpoint platform is the fact that it's a platform, right? You covered the fact that Proofpoint is commonly seen as that really great, email security, product. But the reality is that our data is all over the place. And so having a platform that has insight into a lot of those different avenues, and by avenues, I sometimes mean threat vectors and whatnot, right? And really kind of where our data is, I think is really important. And so I know it seems like Proofpoint's actually listened, right? But we've seen that, right? We've seen that Proofpoint has really listened to what the practitioner needs, what organizations need around DLP to really make it, like I said earlier, more approachable, easier to manage, all of that good stuff. But one of the things that we've identified at Trace3 is that a lot of organizations, maybe even despite some of the improvements that you've called out, really just don't want to manage it, right? Now, yeah. I don't know if that's just because of the horror stories that you alluded to, or if it's kind of the new cultural shift, right? That as a service model, right, where organizations are really just after an outcome, not necessarily another tool or something else that they've got to dedicate resources to. Especially in light of the fact that most IT shops have a hard enough time trying to keep the lights on, right? Adding another tool to the mix can be a challenge from a resource perspective. And that's actually one of the reasons why we've partnered with a company called InfoLock to help not only help drive implementation of DLP, but the ongoing management of DLP to really make it kind of that white glove service to where you can have all the benefits of DLP, especially Proofpoint's DLP and the quality of Proofpoint's DLP, but without the kind of administrative burden and the risk that goes along with that.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, this running DLP as a service can be an absolute game changer for the way that people look at DLP deployments. You don't have to live through those horror stories of the past. My past life, I was an industry analyst at Gartner. I was actually the lead analyst and author for the Enterprise DLP Magic Quadrant when Gartner had one. And that part of that document, beyond the graphic that people don't read, I wrote up a whole section on DLP as a managed service back then. And InfoLock's been one of those key providers in the space for a long, long time. They've got a lot of great knowledge there. And we see the same thing at Proofpoint. I mean, DLP is really a must. And it's really comes down to the fact that IT folks a lot of times, are resource constrained. They don't have that institutional knowledge. They really are looking beyond just, hey, give me a world-class product, but give me a path and a program to build that out. So looking at something like DLP as a service and getting it implemented the right way and making sure that you've got a really well-defined program is really a no-brainer for a lot of these organizations.
You sold me, Brian. You sold me. So, I'm an IT professional. I've got, all the threats that come along with that. I've got all the responsibilities that come with that. What do you tell me to help me get this thing sold, right? I think a lot of organizations, maybe their IT leadership maybe wants to move it forward, but they're having trouble kind of, getting it across the finish line. How do you try to help those organizations bring in this really needed technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most security leaders get it. Most IT and InfoSec teams get it. But the problem is the disconnect between IT and InfoSec and the rest of the business. So a lot of business isn't thinking about data security and DLP as top of mind. They're thinking about things that they can do to improve and optimize their business and drive toward a business outcome. They don't always understand the gaps between sort of traditional controls, non-DLP security controls versus things that are triangulating content, behavior, and threat. So it really starts with framing the problem in a way that the business can understand. They can understand what the outcome looks like, and they can understand what the value in that outcome looks like. So communicating the various attack vectors from whether it's insider threat, insider risk, accidental disclosure, ransomware is critical. Describing the controls that exist today, and then doing a gap analysis, highlighting, hey, here are the potential gaps and issues that we might come across. The other thing that drives a lot of these programs is legal and regulatory drivers for compliance. Simply aren't enough. A lot of times it's moved beyond just ticking the checkbox. We used to talk about my industry analyst days. There were only 3 reasons back in the day why anybody in their right mind deployed a DLP program. You had some sort of regulatory compliance driver, you had some sort of intellectual property that you knew about, or you were just looking for some way to monitor and visualize how data was moving, data visibility and monitoring, because you're throwing tools at the problem because you had no clue how the business was really operating when it came to apps and data.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard of this disconnect between IT and the business before.
Yeah, shocker, right?
Yeah, I wish that weren't the case, but no, I think you're spot on. I think if we can break down that and communicate, technical risk into business terms and really kind of get people on board, I think people will very clearly see the value. So I appreciate the insight. Now, it's clear to me that this isn't, kind of like your grandpa's DLP, right? So if organizations have not taken a look at DLP and specifically Proofpoint DLP recently, I think it's clear they need to take a second look, right? But to kind of drive that home, we're going to play a little bit of DLP Fact or Fiction, put you in the hot seat. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it. I didn't know I was going to be in the hot seat, but let's fire away.
Surprise, surprise, right?
Shocking.
So the first one, I'm going to throw a slow ball here for you. DLP systems can only protect data stored within the company's premises.
Oh, wow. This is like the softball you knock out of the park, right? Fact or fiction? This is fiction, right? DLP is not limited to just data stored on premises. I mean, we talked about it earlier, right, Kyle? The way that people's work has changed. People can work from anywhere, and data could theoretically be everywhere all at once, whether it's on a cloud shared drive, whether it's on a third-party system, whether it's contained in some sort of proprietary application. Proofpoint's DLP is really designed to protect data wherever it resides, whether it's on-prem, cloud, hybrid environment, what have you. And DLP solutions are really set up to where they can monitor and control that data movement as it moves between these different environments, ensuring protection moves beyond just the physical boundaries of the traditional on-premises organization.
Yeah, I knew that was an easy one for you, but at the same time, I can't tell you how many people don't quite understand the breadth and depth or the capabilities that DLP really offers, and specifically Proofpoint's DLP. So you're 1 for 1. You're starting off well. We'll see if that trend continues. So the next one. DLP technology is primarily used for compliance purposes.
Yeah, again, fiction. Again, we just talked about this a minute ago. It used to be, even in the old days, DLP was predominantly, again, regulatory compliance, intellectual property, or just some understanding of data visibility and movement. But we've moved into some additional use cases. And again, 2024 here, there's still certainly compliance drivers out there that companies just can't ignore, whether we're talking about HIPAA in the healthcare space for patient privacy, or PCI DSS, for payment cardholder data, or GDPR for privacy mandates, or even some of the U.S. state level. There's now 6 states in the U.S. that have state level privacy regulations around sharing of data and individual privacy rights. Again, these regulatory compliance things that you run into, they're a critical driver. They're certainly a great way to tie into that business use case for a lot of organizations, but that's not the whole story. We've talked about, there's some other very real security use cases for DLP, even in, sort of the OG way of thinking about DLP, intellectual property out there, very specific. Every company's got IP that they want to keep inside, trade secrets, pre-released information, design documents, formulary data, what have you. And DLP is really uniquely positioned to help secure that data regardless of where it resides.
Absolutely. I think, to your point, compliance sometimes is that first or initial driver, right, for, talking about DLP, but it quickly pivots into security. When we look at a lot of like the privacy regulations that you mentioned, right, all of them will talk about privacy and the requirements around that, but then they'll also typically end with something like, and oh yeah, by the way, you need to have a reasonable security program. And I'm a big believer that DLP is a key aspect of any robust security program. So absolutely, agree with your points there. So you're 100% so far. And we'll see if we can continue that success. The next one, DLP solutions can prevent or limit data breaches by detecting unusual data transmission activities.
And I'll give this one a bit of a caveat here. Definitely a fact if configured properly. So if we think about today's threat, we talked earlier about ransomware and sort of the related things like double extortion and the data exfiltration side of ransomware. This is one of the huge byproducts and benefits of DLP, being able to pick up on some of this outbound data movement. If you've got prevention rules in place, potentially preventing it. So to answer your question, definitely a fact in that sense. But also looking at some of the detection anomalies and some of the more modern DLP platforms like Proofpoint, being able to look at anomalous user activity, anomalous user intent of how that data is being accessed or transmitted. Things like setting up rules and analyzing that user behavior. These modern DLP platforms can identify all this unusual activity that may indicate some sort of data breach or an attempt at a breach, or some sort of setup to staging or pre-exfiltration of data. So some of this preemptive detection can really be a bit of an early warning indicator to threats before significant damage gets done.
Yeah, that's huge. I actually think that's one of the biggest selling points of DLP in today's threat landscape, right? And I think you mentioned, identifying some of that anomalous behavior. So whether we're looking at that, malicious or even ignorant insider, or that threat actor, a lot of our executive clients are asking, look, like, I know we keep saying, it's not a matter of if, but when. Well, how can we limit the blast radius, right? How can we get insight into that early enough to be able to limit the impact to us? And I think you've called out some really great use cases there, great examples of how Proofpoint's DLP, really kind of being, different than DLP of the past, right? Is really setting up organizations for success in mitigating some of that risk in a really meaningful way. So good stuff there for sure. And so now we've got one last question here. See if we can end on a good note. Organizations are fully covered from a DLP perspective by using the capabilities offered through their cloud service provider.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of cloud service providers out there, big fan of your productivity platforms out there. This one is fiction. All of them have solid capabilities and, they're certainly adding value to their clients, but they're not going to offer the same level of capabilities that are purpose built that a platform like Proofpoint would. So, for example, a lot of organizations just aren't really in one single cloud. If you think about all the different productivity platforms, all the different provider platforms that people are using between cloud, hybrid, let alone some of the on-premises things you're doing, writing that unified, that policy uniformity, that defined set of controls that are uniform across all those places, it's really hard to do if you're going to rely on the platform to do it itself. I mean, even think about it, if you're all in with Microsoft, data typically has to get into that environment and get shared somehow beyond it. So how do you handle those use cases? Plus, when the platforms are solid, it's just not what they do. It's, goes beyond the products being easy to manage. And this really leads to a lot of the traditional issues with DLP deployments, was the scope of these programs being sort of stuck at being very limited because you were siloed in creating policy, you were siloed in getting visibility and alerts out of there. At the end of the day, organizations really need to have a DLP solution that's easy to deploy, it's easy to set up and manage, particularly if they use a managed service around a really strong modern DLP platform, and extend that to wherever the data reach goes, which very often, and high 99% of the time, it's beyond just a single cloud provider.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. And I think the other, aspect to that is, what Proofpoint brings to the table from an integrations perspective, right? Almost extending the capability across, not just, one cloud, but multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, really kind of wherever the data is. And that, I think, is really what the target is for most businesses. So really great information there. It was awesome to have you here to kind of set the record straight on what, a modern DLP solution like Proofpoint has to offer for the enterprise. Like I said earlier, you've sold me. I really hope that this, message sinks in to other business and IT leaders. I think that you've covered a lot of ground here and that the message should really resonate. So really appreciate you being here with us today.
Awesome, Kyle. It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.